This past week, I had a chance to go on an Asian American field trip, which I highly recommend to anyone. So for myself, I live in Orange County. We went on to Amtrak, which then took us all the way to Union Station. And then from there, we were able to get off and see Olvera Street, go to a Chinese American museum, have lunch in Japantown, go to the Japanese American Museum, and then head back Amtrak all the way back to Orange County. And so it was a great day trip out there. I highly recommend it. So today I just wanted to talk about the Chinese American Museum. I just want to share first of all that I had never been there before. It's this red brick building. It's 2 stories. It's not the largest museum, but there are some really interesting things in there, including a timeline. I love looking at timelines, and so I thought I'd read some of the events from 1840 to 1890 just to overview some of the things that were happening in our country. So let's begin with the 1840s. As Europe's African slave trade ends, indentured Chinese and contracted Asian Indians are hired to work around the world in place of African slaves. 1839 to 1842, England defeats China in First Opium War, taking Hong Kong and deepening China's opium epidemic. 1846 to 1848, Mexican-American War. 1849, the gold rush begins with the discovery of gold at Sutter's Mill, drawing many fortune seekers, including Chinese. Moving to the 1850s. In 1850, California becomes a state. 1850 to 1864, Europe defeats China in Second Opium War. The coolie trade begins in China. 1851, Indian Appropriations Act displaces American Indians from their land onto reservations. 1850, United States Census lists 2 Chinese men in Los Angeles. 1852, 20,000 Chinese enter the United States, mostly California, only 17 are women. California levies a foreign miners tax. The burden of paying falls mostly on Chinese and Latino miners. 1854, People versus George W. Hall prohibits Chinese and other people of color from testifying against whites. 1859, newspaper, the Los Angeles Star reports the arrival of the first Chinese woman in Los Angeles. Moving to the 1860s. 1861 to 1865, American Civil War, 51 Chinese soldiers fought in that. 13th Amendment abolishes slavery and the Reconstruction era begins. In 1863, President Abraham Lincoln issues the Emancipation Proclamation. And the time of this video release, it's actually very close to Juneteenth. It's just past Juneteenth. 1860. Droughts, famine, and political unrest in southern China. Those push factors that are there sometimes. 1862, California imposes a police tax of $2.50 a month on all Chinese. It's a lot of money during this time. 1865 to 69, Transcontinental Railroad recruit thousands of Chinese laborers. Eastern and western portions of the railroad are joined at Promontory Summit, Utah. Many of you probably have seen this photo, which excludes Chinese Americans who were a huge contributor to this connection. 1866, Civil Rights Act grants persons of every race and color eligible for citizenship all privileges to make contracts, hold property, and testify in court. The law does not apply to Chinese. The idea of persons who are eligible for citizenship is an important distinction. 1868, the Burlingame Treaty allows unrestricted Chinese immigration to supply cheap labor to build railroads. I have a friend who talks about Chinese Americans and how Chinese Americans and Chinese were invited to come to the United States to work, and they work very hard. 14th Amendment grants full citizenship to native-born or naturalized Americans, including former slaves and immigrants. 1870s, 15th Amendment extends voting rights to blacks. 1870, Nationality Act specifies that only free whites and African aliens are eligible for naturalization. 1872, California's anti-miscegenation law prohibits interracial marriage. 1879, Dennis Kearney establishes the Los Angeles chapter of the Working Man's Party known as the Anti-Chinese Union. 1870s, anti-Chinese violence in California. 1870s, California outlaws the immigration of Chinese, Japanese, and Mongolian women for prostitution. So, in 1871, dispute between two Chinese lead to the accidental shooting of a Caucasian man and sparks the Los Angeles Chinese massacre. A mob of 500 Angelenos attacks Chinatown, killing 19 Chinese men and boys. My understanding is this is one of the largest lynchings that happened in our country. 1875, Page Law bars entry of Chinese, Japanese, and Mongolian prostitutes, felons, and contract laborers. Many people don't know this, but prior to the 1882 Exclusion Act of Chinese Americans, it was actually women, most women, who were barred from coming to the United States. Asian women. 1876, the Southern Pacific Railroad connects San Francisco and Los Angeles. Hundreds of Chinese railroad workers moved to Los Angeles. 1878, attempts by local legislators to drive Chinese out of Los Angeles through taxation fails when Chinese vegetable peddlers strike in protest. 1879, California prevents local government and corporations from hiring Chinese. Los Angeles County votes against Chinese immigration, 98% to 2%. In the 1880s, 1886, the Statue of Liberty is dedicated. 1880s, anti-Chinese violence in California, Colorado, Washington, Wyoming. Not too long ago, I created an Ed Family video on the burning of Santa Ana, but it wasn't just Santa Ana, it was like lots of other cities around the world, Chinatowns. And once again, these were the only places that Chinese Americans could live, so burning those places would have a huge impact on Chinese Americans. 1882, Congress passes the Chinese Exclusion Act to suspend further immigration of Chinese laborers for 10 years. All Chinese residents are denied naturalizations. Laborers already in the United States cannot bring their wives and children. Only government officials, teachers, students, merchants, and travelers are exempted. So the majority could not bring their wives or children, and this Exclusion Act continues on in our country after the 10 years continues on. 1884, Tate versus Hurley creates segregated schools for Chinese children until the 1930s. 1886, Chinese laundrymen win case in Yikwo versus Hopkins, declaring that a law with unequal impact on different groups is discriminatory. 1888, a Chinese shrine is added to the Evergreen Cemetery in the Boyle Heights area of Los Angeles. Scott Act prohibits the return of 20,000 Chinese laborers who had left the United States. So if they left the United States, couldn't come back. All right, so there are more dates, but I thought I'd just go ahead and share just a few of these to give a picture for what it was like, the experience for Chinese Americans, to help us understand the Chinese American story, which is also an American story, but also a Chinese American story. This is Dr. Jeff from Ed Family, signing out.